The knock came at 2:17 a.m., sharp and desperate, cutting through my sleep like glass through skin. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made my heart jolt before my mind could catch up. In that fragile space between dreaming and waking, I already knew something was wrong. When I opened the door, the hallway light spilled over a familiar face from next door, pale, trembling, eyes carrying a fear so raw it stole the air from my lungs. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry out. Her plea came in a whisper so soft it felt like it might shatter if spoken any louder, begging me not to let her go back alone. Before the story continues, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet power of being there for someone when it matters most, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel, The Kindness Chronicles. Your support keeps stories like this alive. I had lived in that apartment building for almost 3 years, long enough to recognize footsteps in the hallway and the rhythm of the old pipes when winter pressed its cold hands against the walls. She had moved in 6 months earlier. We were neighbors in the way most people are now, exchanging nods, brief smiles, the occasional polite greeting near the mailboxes. I knew her name from the label on her door, knew she worked long hours because her lights stayed on late, and knew she often returned home with shoulders slumped, carrying something heavier than grocery bags. But I didn't know her story, not really, and at that moment, standing barefoot on the cold floor, I realized how little we often know about the people closest to us. The hallway smelled faintly of detergent and dust. She stood there wrapped in a thin jacket that looked like it had been grabbed in a hurry, her hands shaking despite the warmth inside my apartment. I stepped aside without thinking, letting her in, my mind racing with questions I didn't ask. She moved like someone afraid of being seen, eyes darting back toward her own door as if it were a place she feared more than the darkness outside. Inside, the apartment felt suddenly too quiet. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded louder than usual, marking seconds that felt heavy and important. I offered her the couch, then a glass of water, my hands moving on instinct while my thoughts lagged behind. She sat stiffly, fingers clenched together, breathing shallow, as if she had run a long distance without moving at all. I wanted to ask what happened. I wanted to know why she was afraid to be alone, why the night itself seemed to press against her. But something told me this wasn't a moment for questions. This was a moment for presence. So I sat across from her, giving her space, letting the silence stretch until it felt safe enough for her to breathe. As minutes passed, her shoulders slowly dropped, the tension easing just enough for the truth to begin leaking through her guarded posture. Without quoting her words, her story unfolded in fragments and heavy pauses. She spoke of a past she thought she had escaped, of a relationship that had taught her to doubt her own strength, of a place that looked like home from the outside but felt like a trap once the door closed. That night, something had triggered old fears she thought were buried. The walls of her apartment had felt too close, the memories too loud, and the idea of being alone with them had become unbearable. Listening to her, I felt a familiar ache rise in my chest, the recognition of fear that doesn't always come from present danger but from echoes that refuse to fade. I had my own ghosts, different in shape but similar in weight. There was a time in my life when nights felt endless, when silence became an enemy, when asking for help felt like admitting defeat. Hearing her story was like holding a mirror to parts of myself I rarely looked at. The challenge in that moment wasn't dramatic or heroic. It was simple and profound at the same time. I had to choose whether to step into someone else's pain, knowing it might stir my own, or to keep a safe distance and offer polite concern. Kindness often asks for more than comfort. It asks for courage. I made her tea, the kind my mother used to make when the world felt too sharp. The steam rose between us, carrying a warmth that softened the edges of the room. We sat there as the night deepened, the city outside quiet except for the occasional passing car. Time moved differently then, slower, gentler, as if the world itself had decided to give us a pause. She didn't want grand solutions. She didn't want promises that everything would be fine. She just didn't want to be alone. And so I stayed awake with her, listening when she spoke, sitting quietly when she didn't. The hours crept toward morning, and with each passing minute, the fear in her eyes loosened its grip. But the night wasn't done testing us. Just before dawn, she froze, her body stiffening as a sound echoed faintly from the hallway. It was nothing, probably someone leaving early for work, but fear doesn't care about logic. I watched her retreat inward, the progress we had made threatened by a single noise. That was when I realized how fragile healing can be, how easily it can be shaken by reminders of old wounds. I moved closer, not touching, just close enough for her to feel that she wasn't facing the fear alone. I spoke softly, grounding her in the present, reminding her where she was, reminding her that the night was passing. It wasn't a magical moment where fear vanished. It was a slow, uneven process, like learning to breathe again after being underwater too long. As light finally began to seep through the curtains, painting the walls with pale gold, something shifted. Morning has a way of changing things, not by erasing pain but by offering perspective. She looked different in the daylight, still tired, still shaken, but steadier. The world felt less threatening when shadows retreated. She apologized for waking me, her voice heavy with guilt, and I felt a quiet anger rise at the idea that anyone should feel ashamed for asking for help. I told her she never needed to apologize for surviving, for reaching out when strength ran thin. In that moment, I realized how often we minimize our own needs, how society teaches us to endure silently rather than lean on one another. The days that followed were not instantly brighter. Healing rarely works that way. But something had changed between us. We were no longer just neighbors sharing a wall. We were witnesses to each other's humanity. She began leaving her door open when she was home, just a crack, a silent signal that she was okay but not alone. Sometimes we shared coffee in the mornings, sometimes just a wave in the hallway that carried more meaning than words. She started therapy again, something she had been avoiding out of fear of reopening old wounds. I saw her struggle with it, saw the exhaustion that came from facing pain head-on. But I also saw moments of strength emerge, small victories that might have gone unnoticed if you weren't looking closely. A laugh that came easier. A posture that stood a little taller. A confidence that returned in quiet, unannounced ways. As for me, I learned something too. I learned that kindness isn't always about fixing problems or offering perfect advice. Sometimes it's about opening your door in the middle of the night and letting someone sit with their fear until it loosens its hold. It's about choosing connection over convenience, empathy over indifference. There were nights after that when I lay awake, thinking about how close she had been to staying alone, to spiraling deeper into memories that hurt her. I wondered how many people around us were standing in their own hallways, hearts pounding, afraid to knock on a door. The thought stayed with me, changing the way I moved through the world, softening my judgments, widening my compassion. Months passed. Seasons shifted. The building felt warmer, not because anything physically changed, but because I had started to see it differently. Every door held a story. Every face carried battles unseen. And that knowledge made kindness feel less like an act and more like a responsibility. One evening, long after that night, she stopped by again. Not out of fear this time, but to say goodbye. A new job had opened up in another city, a fresh start she felt ready to take. There was sadness in her leaving, but also pride. She had rebuilt herself piece by piece, and now she was choosing a future that felt safe and hopeful. Watching her walk down the hallway for the last time, I felt a strange mix of loss and gratitude. We hadn't saved each other in any dramatic sense. We had simply shared a moment when one human needed another, and that had been enough to change the direction of both our lives. That night taught me that bravery doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through a cracked door at 2:17 a.m., asking not to be alone. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is answer. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of a time you needed someone or a time you were there for another person, please take a moment now to like this video, share it with someone who believes in compassion, and subscribe to The Kindness Chronicles. Your engagement helps these stories reach hearts that might need them tonight. Before you go, I have a special request. Please comment the word kindness below, and if you feel comfortable, share a moment when someone showed up for you or when you showed up for someone else. You never know whose night you might change just by telling your story.